One meeting, one decision, and Ukraine was left without U.S. support. How did Zelensky anger Trump in a minute, lose allies, and miss his last chance for help? Americans are furious. Even the brightest eyes are turning away. What happened in the Oval Office? Why is Europe no longer rushing to support Ukraine? And most importantly, what awaits the country now without American billions? This is a story about how one wrong word can change the fate of an entire country. Watch until the end. In the finale, we reveal the moment after which there is no turning back. Washington, the Oval Office. The light aroma of expensive tobacco still lingers in the air after meeting with guests. Several folders remain on the huge oak desk, one of which is titled Ukraine. The door opened. Volodymyr Zelensky entered the room, hunched over and casually tugging at his dark sweater. Instead of the usual handshake, Trump simply nodded toward the chair across from him. Vladimir, sit down. Zelensky turns on, arms crossed over his chest. Look at him tense, but there is a facade in him. Just yesterday, he was sure that this meeting was just a formality. But now, looking into the eyes of the 47th President of the United States, he understands something went wrong. Let's not make long speeches, Zelensky says with irritation. We need to discuss arms supplies. Us. Trump chuckles and leans back in his chair. That's an interesting way to put it. I thought you had something to convince me of. The president's voice sounds calm but cold. He does not tolerate being spoken to as an equal, especially when the interlocutor is in the position of a petitioner. Let's be honest, Zelensky continues, gesturing with his hand. You and I both understand that Ukraine will not survive without U.S. support. So why are you acting like this, saying I need this more than you do? Trump looks straight into his eyes, then slowly picks up the document from the table. The room grows quiet, as if before a shot. Zelensky swallows, but tries not to show concern. Have you ever heard the word gratitude? Trump began, opening the documents. American taxpayers have sent more than $150 billion to Ukraine. They support how prices are published, how the economy is collapsing, how more and more homeless people are appearing on the streets. You know what they ask? Trump pauses. For what? Zelensky sighs and shakes his head. Donald, if we lose U.S. support now, it will be a disaster. A disaster for whom? Trump watches him carefully. For America? Or for you? The president's words hang in the air. We can't just leave the war halfway, Zelensky says more harshly, his voice sounding a bit indignant. Do you know what the Americans want? Trump said, walking heavily forward. They want their money in their country, not starting a war in a country that won't compromise. Zelensky opens his mouth, but can't find what to say. You know what really pisses me off? Trump said. You agreed to develop mineral resources. We discussed it. And then you go to the press and say you turned it down. Zelensky blinks. He hadn't expected the question to come up so early. It was a complicated process. He tried to justify himself. No, that was a lie, Trump snaps. You were trying to play both sides. Zelensky is grinding his teeth. Did you really think I'd swallow that? Trump smirks. I'm hard to fool, Vladimir. Silence. Heavy, oppressive. Zelensky understands. He controls the control of the meeting. And lastly, Trump's voice becomes almost friendly, but there is nothing threatening in this tone. You came to meet with the President of the United States on this issue. He nods at his sweater. Zelensky works down mechanically. You're in the White House, damn it. You could at least put on a suit. For the first time, when meeting Zelensky's face, he twitches. I am the president of a country. I am in a state of war. You are the president of a country that is losing a war, Trump interrupts. Zelensky stands up abruptly. If you want Ukraine to fall, just say so directly. Trump also rises slowly and leans forward, resting his hands on the table. I want you not to try to play chess with me if you don't even have any pawns left. A light knock is heard somewhere behind the door. The secretary signals that the meeting is nearing its end. Zelensky shows deep surprise and, without saying goodbye, leaves the office. Trump sees him go and shakes his head. Idiot, he says quietly. The Oval Office is silent. But outside, in the corridors of the White House, the conversation is already underway. A political hurricane is underway. And for Zelensky, it will be devastating. The Senate corridor was buzzing like a beehive. Senator Lindsey Graham walked out of her cabinet office, barely restraining herself from slamming the door. Cameras were waiting for him at the exit, dozens of microphones stretched out in front of him. He hadn't intended to speak, but emotions were running high, and there was no point in remaining silent. Did you see that? Graham's voice was loud, almost a growl. He just humiliated the president in his own office. The journalists looked at each other. The senator, who for years had been one of the brightest people in Ukraine, now looked like this. He's tired of the antivirus losing installation. Do you think the U.S. continues to support Zelensky? Someone from the crowd shouted. Graham looked straight into the camera, his face darker than ever. I don't know if we can work with this person at all. The words were explosive. They were all over the headlines within an hour. The message in the White House was the same. If Lindsey Graham was backing away from Ukraine, things were truly out of control. Across town, in a government building, the defense secretary and the national security advisor were discussing what had happened in the Oval Office. I thought he would at least try to behave diplomatically, one of them said irritably, placing a heavy marker with documents on the table. He just doesn't understand what reality he's found himself in, the second one answered. State Department Secretary Marco Rubio meanwhile rewatched the recording of the meeting. He had already seen this fragment 10 times. Zelensky was speaking on the screen. We need the U.S. to continue to supply weapons. And then, literally a minute later, we do not accept any conditions. This is a matter of principle. Rubio then turned off the recording and threw the pen down on the table. He either doesn't know how to run a radio station, or he doesn't care about the consequences. I don't care, the assistant replied. He thinks he'll get help anyway. Then he is wrong. Silence fell over the room. He blew the last meeting of his life, Rubio added quietly. Meanwhile, in the office of one American news editor, the headlines were already forming. Zelensky left the U.S. no choice. Is Washington turning its back on Ukraine? Rudeness instead of diplomacy. How Zelensky lost allies. A broken alliance. Why are even the most loyal landlords turning away from Zelensky? These headlines immediately hit the airwaves, were discussed in prime time, and by the morning had already moved onto the front pages of the newspaper. But the worst effect was within Ukraine itself. It was late evening in Kiev. Zelensky's advisors sat at a long table in the administration hall, their faces tense. We need to change the focus immediately, one of them said. This meeting could ruin everything. Already destroyed, he interrupted the second, scrolling through the newsfeed. Look what he writes. He turned the laptop screen towards the infected man. It was the same everywhere. Zelensky had lost Washington's trust. We need him to record an urgent message, someone suggested. And what will he say? Another advisor responded, his voice full of sarcasm. Sorry, was I too harsh with the man who controls our arms supplies? He will say that we continue the fight, that we have other allies. What? Europe? They are already afraid that they are left alone with the country. Silence. One of the advisors looked at the ceiling and looked tired. He lost. Not yet, someone muttered. But if we don't change our approach. The phrase hung in the air. They all knew the rest. Ukraine could not afford to lose U.S. support. But it seems to be already hurting. Marco Rubio watched the Oval Office meeting again. The lamp on his desk cast a harsh light on the paper, but he kept his eyes on the screen. Zelensky sat across from Trump, leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed, his lips pursed. We do not accept the conditions, he said. It is a question of principles. Rubio paused and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Damn it. Not the first time, a voice said behind him. The State Department aide entered the office, holding printouts from the think tank. We offered him a move, he was frank. And then he said on camera that he rejected it. He thinks we didn't notice? Rubio's voice was full of irritation. Either he thinks or he doesn't care. Rubio threw the pen on the table. We try to help him. And how does he respond? With lies. He leaned forward and tapped his finger on the screen. Americans are not stupid. They support how their money goes to Ukraine, and now they support how easy it is to use it. Assistant of the look. Support is falling and fast. How fast? The man threw fresh survey data on the table. Support for funding Ukraine. 41% think there is too much aid. Among Republicans, 62%. Rubio ran his eyes over the numbers and circumstances. This is the end. Meanwhile, in Kiev, Zelensky sat in his office, clutching his phone. He didn't need to read the news. He already knew Washington was turning away. We need to make statements urgently, said one of his advisors. Zelensky just grinned. About what? About the fact that the Americans no longer want us to be strong? The advisor hesitated. We must seize the initiative. Launch a new, exciting support. Remind the world that Russia will not stop without us. Do you think this will work? It worked before. Zelensky looked at him and shook his head. It was a different time before. He took a deep breath and threw the phone on the table. What do they say in Europe? They are worried. Britain is offering more help, but without the US, they will not be able to compensate for the losses. Zelensky remained silent. I need to talk to Trump again, he finally said. The advisor looked at him as if he had suggested jumping into the abyss. Do you think he'll want to talk to you after all this? Zelensky gritted his teeth. He has no choice. But even he wasn't sure about that. Washington, the president sat at his massive desk in the Oval Office, filing papers. Homeland Security Secretary J.D. Vance stood next to him, arms folded. Vance asked. The president chuckled, not looking up from his documents. Zelensky? No, I don't understand. He still hopes that we will change our minds. Let him hope. Trump looked up. But he won't get another cent. Vance nodded. The Senate is already debating a resolution to cut aid. Trump put the paper down and leaned forward. It's time to tell the Americans the truth. He pressed a button on the phone. Prepare a statement for the press. An hour later, the White House was in full swing. Cameras were being set up. Reporters were whispering, preparing for the next big announcement. When the president declared war, the room went silent. Friends, he began, looking directly into the camera. We have committed more than $150 billion to support Ukraine. We have done everything we could. But now is the time to put America's interests first. The journalist froze, hanging on every word. Ukraine must understand that we need to negotiate. We cannot finance someone else's war forever. The silence was so thick that one could hear someone in the room clicking a pen. From now on, Trump says, no funds. No blank checks. America is not a bank, and I will not allow taxpayer money to be spent on endless conflict. Kiev. There was dead silence in Zelensky's office. The advisor turned off the broadcast and turned to the president. That's all. Zelensky was silent, looking into the void. We urgently need to find other sources of support, someone said. Who? Zelensky looked up. Europe? The advisors looked at each other. If the US leaves the game, Europe will not be able to bear this burden alone. We need to talk to Britain. Britain will not compensate for losses. Zelensky stood up and walked to the window. Outside, Kiev was living its life. People were rushing through the streets, not knowing that in just a few minutes their country had lost everything. What now? Someone asked. Zelensky did not respond. He already knew. Kiev. Office of the President. Zelensky sat in a dark office, staring at his laptop screen as the headlines flickered one after another. Trump closed his wallet. Ukraine no longer receives automatic aid. U.S. disappointed in Zelensky. Washington demands regime with economy. U.S. support for Ukraine collapses. 62% of Republicans consider aid residual. He pressed his lips together and looked at the advisors sitting opposite him. What the hell? No one. They understand that any excuses will sound pathetic. Are we just going to lose support after everything we've done? The advisor coughed. Mr. President, the fact is that in Washington they think that we have painted ourselves into a corner. Zelensky turned to him abruptly. This is their convenient excuse. They just want to get out of the game. Not only them, another advisor added quietly. Zelensky narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? He placed a printout in front of him. Europe is concerned about the decline in U.S. support for Ukraine. Britain is ready to help, but without the president's participation, its resources are limited. We are losing ground not only in the U.S. In Europe, they are afraid that without the U.S., they are left alone with the country. Zelensky squeezed calculators. We can't afford it. We are already in this situation, Mr. President, someone said from around the corner. There was silence. What about the polls? Zelensky asked, addressing his media advisor. This is hard to take. Bad news. He brought up a diagram on the screen. In 2022, 72% of Americans believed that you would lead Ukraine to victory. Now 48%. And that was before your visit to Washington. Zelensky ran his hand over his face. What do people think about me personally? The advisor looked away. Better not ask. Zelensky gritted his teeth. We need to seize the initiative urgently. How? The president thought about it. We are launching a media campaign. I will record an appeal. People need to return to the fact that Russia will not stop without us. The advisors looked at each other. Maybe we should discuss the microphone after all, someone suggested cautiously. Zelensky turned around abruptly. Negotiation? We have no choice. The U.S. has made it clear that they will not finance us indefinitely. Europe cannot afford a war without the Americans. If we do not begin to prepare for negotiations, they will simply be imposed on us. The president looked at him silently. So you're suggesting that we surrender? I propose to save the country while there is still a chance. Zelensky leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He knew this conversation was inevitable, but he wasn't prepared to hear it so soon. London. Residence of the Prime Minister. Keir Starmer rubbed his temples slowly as he listened to the interpreter. Zelensky had just finished his speech. There was a tense silence in the room. "Let me be clear, Vladimir," Starmer said, stepping into his chair. "Are you asking Britain to lead support for Ukraine now that America is backed down?" Zelensky pursed his lips. "We need help. We can't stop now." Starmer gave a short laugh and looked at his advisors. "We are ready to help. But there is one no." Zelensky tensed up. "You will have to be flexible in negotiations." The president of Ukraine slowly raised his eyes. "What does it mean?" "This means that you will have to find a way to compromise with Russia." There was silence in the room. "Are you asking me to surrender?" Starmer shook his head. "I suggest you think about the future of Ukraine." Zelensky stood up abruptly. "No." The British Prime Minister also straightened up. "You must understand, Vladimir, we are not Americans. We cannot disclose the level of assistance that was given to you in Washington. Europe is exhausted." Zelensky turned slowly. "I understand." Starmer looked at him carefully. "Understand this too. This is not betrayal. This is reality." The Ukrainian president made an abrupt about-face and made a statement. Starmer's advisor awaits. "He won't agree." The prime minister frowned. He lost his sense of reality. On the way to the airport, Zelensky sat in the dark interior of the car, looking out the window. The advisor next to him coughed cautiously. "Mr. President, perhaps we should reconsider our changes?" Zelensky did not take his eyes off the streets of London that flashed past the glass. "No. But if we don't accept the conditions..." Zelensky slowly turned to face him. "Are you saying that I should sit at the table with Putin?" The advisor remained silent. "Then tell me straight." "I'm saying that we can't win without support." Zelensky opened up. "We don't allow ourselves to lose." But he knew that reality already dictated other conditions. Kiev. Night. Lights were on in the windows of the presidential office. Advisors sat around a long table, their faces tense. "The protests have been uncovered," the head of security said, throwing a printout of the headlines on the table. "People are taking to the streets, demanding attention." Zelensky leaned forward. "What exactly do they need?" The advisor said carefully. "Where is the money? Why did they betray us?" "Zelensky must go." The president covered his face with his hands. "Is this being fueled by pro-Russian forces?" "No," said the advisor. "He's our citizen." A cold wind of doubt swept through the room. "What about the army?" Zelensky asked, straightening up. The head of the military department slowly raised his eyes. "Morale is at zero. The fighters are exhausted. Without American support, resources are running out. And the West? Britain is ready to give money, but only if we start with the market. France says the same. Poland does not want to get involved in the conflict if the U.S. leaves." Zelensky clasped his fingers. "So that's it." The advisors were silent. That same evening, he went out onto the balcony. Kiev lived its life, but now it was a different city. A city where people understood that their reservations were won. The phone vibrated in his pocket. "I'm listening." The head of intelligence's voice was short and clear. "You need to leave the city." Zelensky froze. "What?" "We have information that a group of military personnel is discussing a change of power." "Are these rumors?" "This is a warning." Silence. "When?" "In the coming days." Zelensky closed his eyes. He knew that this day would come sooner or later. Kiev. Presidential residence. Zelensky stood by the window, looking out at the city at night. The anxious lights of the headlights glided along the streets where mass rallies had recently taken place. Now everything was quiet, but it was the calm before the storm. The phone vibrated again on the table. He already knew who it was. "It's time for you to leave," the head of intelligence said calmly, but there was no doubt in it. Zelensky exhaled. "You are sure?" "This is not being discussed. There is information that in the government watch a group of high-ranking military officers will announce the transition to alternative leadership." The president closed his eyes. "Is this a military coup?" "This is a change of power. And if you stay, no one will be able to ensure your safety." He is slow to understand. "What choice do I have?" "The plane is ready. Departure is in 2 hours. We will take you to it without any fuss." Zelensky slowly put the phone away. 2 hours. He sat down at the table, his fingers tapping on the wooden surface. It was over. There were no angry speeches, no pompous statements. Only cold awareness. The Americans no longer supported him. Europe was disowning him. The army was exhausted. The people were furious. He lost. The door opened and the advisor entered. Time. Zelensky looked into his office for the last time. Then he stood up, exhaled, and stepped into the darkness. He was the symbol of struggle, the face of resistance, the man who fertilized the world. But one meeting changed everything. America returned. Europe doubted. The army weakened. Pre-populated. Last call. Last order. Last chance to save yourself. Now it's not his war anymore. What next? What price does he pay for his mistakes? Don't miss new revelations. Subscribe, like, and click the bell.